What if the bravest man in town couldn't hold himself together at his wife's grave, and only his dog saw him break? What if you spent your life pretending to be strong, until the only soul who saw you break was your loyal dog? In a quiet town, a grieving officer and his old German shepherd visit a grave each week, haunted by loss and silence. One day, a boy appears in the mist, carrying a sadness too big for words. What unfolds is not just a story of grief, but of hidden bonds, unspoken love, and the small, wordless acts that can heal even the deepest wounds. Stay, because some stories find you where you're most alone and show you what it means to come home. The air that afternoon carried the flavor of distant rain, sharp and metallic, yet dulled by the slow drift of autumn. Maple leaves carpeted the cemetery hill, curled and brittle underfoot, their colors dimmed to ochre and brown. Samuel Carter parked the old Ford at the far end of the gravel lane, hands gripping the steering wheel a moment longer than needed, eyes fixed on the silhouette of the church steeple through the wavering mist. He sat a while, breathing against the heaviness that pressed into his chest, the same weight that had been his companion for 2 years now. In the passenger seat, Riley, his German shepherd, shifted quietly, the only sound the faint scrape of nails on the cracked vinyl floor. The dog's gaze followed Sam's every motion, steady, unhurried, offering no judgment, only presence. Sam reached for the battered bouquet on the dashboard, wild asters and goldenrod bundled with a length of twine. His hands were still large and sure, remnants of another life, another self. He tried to remember the last time he'd let them tremble. He couldn't. Somewhere along the way, after the funeral, after the house went silent, he'd decided that holding himself together was the last thing he could do for her memory. For everyone. Even now, he wore his strength like a coat, buttoned tight against the cold. They crossed the grass together, Riley at his side, their footfalls muffled by the deep litter of leaves. Sam's steps were careful but deliberate. He had learned how to carry pain without limping, how to keep his shoulders squared, his chin set. That habit clung to him, even here, especially here, where the world grew hushed and everything sharp inside him grew soft at the edges. His wife's grave was at the edge of the cemetery, beneath a low-leaning elm whose roots pressed up through the earth like old hands searching for light. The stone was simple, her name cut deep, nothing ornamental. Sam brushed away a drift of leaves from the marble and placed the bouquet down, tucking a stray stem back into line. The gesture was precise, almost military. In the presence of the dead, he still stood at attention. Riley settled quietly at his feet, folding himself into the grass. His fur, once jet black, had faded at the muzzle and paws, smoky gray in the wan light. He made no sound, only watched Sam with those deep, liquid eyes, seeing more than a man usually wanted seen. Sam remained standing, one hand on the stone, the other in his coat pocket. The sky above churned with low, silver clouds. Somewhere nearby, a train horn sounded, thin and far off. The world felt paused, as if holding its breath for him. He took it as a cue, inhaled, then exhaled, measuring the rise and fall of his own chest, like a man checking for cracks in a dam. There had been a time not so long ago when he'd been the center post for an entire family. His strength, the thing that kept everything upright. His silence, the ballast. In the months after his wife died, that posture only stiffened. He became what he imagined others needed. Reliable, solid, unbreakable. Even Riley, rescued from the fire with her, seemed to expect nothing less. They were both survivors. After all, men of duty, the last to leave, the first to shoulder a burden. So Sam learned to go through each day by rote, all the rituals of grief made private and controlled. He kept the house tidy, kept his face calm, kept the tears sealed off behind a fortress of habit. Now, as the wind tugged at his collar and ruffled Riley's fur, Sam crouched at the headstone and began to pull away the small detritus of the season. Twigs, a wilted blossom, a scrap of faded ribbon from last month's visit. He worked methodically, as if order could be restored to the universe one gesture at a time. Riley shifted closer, resting his chin on the back of Sam's hand, the warmth of his breath seeping into Sam's knuckles. Sam paused, feeling that gentle weight, a reminder that someone still noticed when he faltered, even if he didn't show it. He cleared his throat, as if to push the feeling away. The dog's eyes never left him, dark and unwavering, patient as dusk. For a moment, Sam let his hand linger on Riley's head, fingers threading through the thick fur behind the ears. The dog didn't move, just leaned in, solid, grounding, steadfast. All around them, the cemetery was quiet but not empty. The hush of wind in the trees, the distant call of crows, the far-off laughter of children echoing from the playground beyond the fence. Each sound slipped through the silence like threads of another life. One Sam could almost remember if he tried. He didn't. He kept his gaze down, shoulders locked, eyes dry. But Riley did not look away. He watched Sam with the deep knowing that only dogs seem to possess, the ability to see the hurt beneath the armor, to know when the show of strength is only for the world, not for oneself. It was Riley who closed the distance, who pressed closer, who nudged Sam's arm with a soft persistence that said, "Enough. You don't have to do this alone." Something in Sam's chest fluttered, then stilled. For a long time he stayed there, unmoving, the air growing colder as the light faded. He was a statue of habit and muscle memory, of old promises and newer aches. But inside, cracks began to show. Subtle, quiet, dangerous. He felt the sting at the bridge of his nose, the tightness behind his eyes, and for the first time in many visits, he didn't push it away. He bowed his head, letting his palm rest on Riley's head, closing his eyes against the world. No words, just breath, just warmth, just the small comfort of not having to be made of stone, not in this moment. Riley stayed beside him, unhurried, his presence a silent permission. The light drained from the sky, and Sam realized he was trembling, not from cold, but from the sudden, unfamiliar relief of letting himself be seen. In that hush, with only his dog as witness, Samuel Carter allowed himself to break. And in breaking, he began, quietly, almost secretly, to heal. Evening crept down from the ridge in thin gray ribbons, threading through the boughs of the cypress and maple trees. Sam lingered by the grave longer than usual, waiting for the chill to bite through his coat, as if discomfort might keep his mind anchored to the here and now. Riley had wandered a short distance off, his paws barely whispering against the wet grass. A faint mist began to rise from the low ground, curling and sinking among the stones, softening their sharp edges. Sam finally stood, brushing the damp from his knees, gathering himself in that quiet way of men who've grown used to leaving pieces of themselves behind. He dropped a glance at Riley, expecting to see the dog poised by his side, ready for the next silent command. But Riley was frozen on the path ahead, neck stretched, ears sharply forward. The dog's whole body was stilled, muscles strung tight, nose working the air. Sam's gaze followed Riley's line of sight, down a narrow corridor formed by the parallel shadows of old boughs. There, almost blurred into the fog, was the shape of a child. A boy, small and spare, knees pulled to his chest, sat hunched on the ground beside a weathered, unmarked headstone. His outline flickered in and out as the mist shifted, like a memory not yet fully formed. Sam's first instinct was caution, a policeman's habit, ingrained over decades. The cemetery was large, and the town itself not immune to sadness. He paused, heart ticking slow and heavy, letting his breath settle before taking a step forward. Riley moved first, silent as dusk itself, pads soundless on moss and gravel. He approached the boy in a gentle arc, keeping his body low, his posture relaxed, tail level. Not a threat, not a demand, just an invitation. The boy didn't move away. His head was bowed, the fair hair catching stray beams of light and shining damp with mist. The slender arms clutched a single reed, a stalk of wild grass with a soft, feathery tip, turning it over and over in small, anxious hands. Sam kept his distance at first, letting Riley take the lead. There was a wisdom in that, a dog's approach, patient and wordless. The boy didn't flinch as Riley drew near. Instead, he glanced up, eyes rimmed with the rawness of recent tears. They were blue, or perhaps gray, colors faded by sadness. Riley settled beside him, lowering his great head until his muzzle nearly brushed the boy's knee. He did not bark or whine, only gazed with that deep, endless patience reserved for the wounded. For a long moment, no one moved. The boy's shoulders shook in small, muffled waves. The world seemed to hold its breath. Sam remained back, blending into the hush of the place, arms folded loosely, his presence more shadow than substance. He studied the child, the too thin arms, the way his shoes didn't quite fit, the old jacket zipped up to the chin. Someone somewhere had cared enough to dress him against the chill. But there was no sign of any adult nearby. No voices, no hurried footsteps, only the slow, ancient settling of evening. Riley extended his nose and gently nudged the boy's hand. At the touch, the reed fell, and the boy's grip instinctively tightened on the dog's fur. He buried his face in the thick ruff at Riley's neck, and for the first time his small body eased, if only slightly. Sam felt a strange ache rise in his chest, a mingling of grief and recognition. The boy's silent sorrow was a mirror, too precise and sharp to look at directly. The leaves around them rustled in a sudden breeze. In the shifting light, the cemetery seemed to expand and contract, as if breathing. Sam felt the urge to speak, to offer comfort, or to ask the questions he'd been trained to ask. Are you lost? Are you hurt? Where are your parents? But none of these belonged in the hush that had fallen here. Instead, he watched, a witness to a communion that required no interpreter. As the minutes slipped by, the boy's trembling subsided. Riley remained steadfast, unmoving except for the occasional slow blink or the twitch of an ear. Sam's thoughts drifted to his own childhood. Long days spent alone in fields behind his family's house. The way loneliness could fill up all the spaces inside. Growing so large there was no room left for words. He wondered how long the boy had sat here, how many times he'd made this pilgrimage, and if anyone had noticed his absence. A lone crow called from a nearby fence post, startling a swirl of sparrows into the sky. The boy lifted his head, face blotched and raw, and looked toward Sam for the first time. Not with fear, but with a sort of measured wariness. Sam nodded, a gesture of acknowledgement, nothing more. In that silent exchange, something shifted. The boy released Riley and stood up, brushing dirt from his palms. He bent to pick up the fallen reed, fingers smoothing its length. Then, with a last lingering touch to the dog's shoulder, he turned and slipped away among the stones, soft, almost spectral, leaving only a faint trail in the dew. Riley remained where he was, head high, ears pricked, watching the boys retreat until he vanished into the mist. Only then did he glance back at Sam, the question unspoken in his eyes. Sam exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the encounter settle into his bones. The cemetery was quiet again, the air thick with the scent of rain and fallen leaves. He let Riley come to him, laid a steady hand on the dog's neck, feeling the warmth, the heartbeat, the silent reassurance that not all bonds must be spoken to be true. Together, man and dog retraced their path along the avenue of cypress, two shadows in the deepening dusk, bearing with them the memory of a small figure in the mist, and the understanding that sometimes the loneliest places are the ones where we find each other. By the next weekend, the sky had settled into a gray permanence, the sort of light that blurred the edge of every shadow, making even noon look like dusk. Sam woke early, moved through the house on automatic, coffee, toast, jacket, keys, but something in him was slower, softer, as if the silence of the cemetery had followed him home and taken up residence in his bones. He drove the same winding route out of town, fields lying fallow now, bare branches scratching against each other in the wind. Riley sat in the passenger seat, head pressed close to the window, silent and watchful as always. The air smelled of distant wood smoke and the rich rot of fallen leaves. Sam's hands on the steering wheel felt steady, but he could sense the old mask slipping, a fracture in the armor, a vulnerability allowed only by absence. They arrived as always, quietly, unannounced. The cemetery was empty but for the wind, stirring last week's offerings. Ribbons, faded photos, scraps of love long surrendered to the elements. Sam hesitated by the gate, looking at the familiar row where his wife's grave rested. Then beyond, along the back path under the cypress, where he'd last seen the boy. The memory of that small figure folded into himself clung to him, shy, unresolved, unfinished. Riley moved ahead, nose twitching as he crossed the dew-heavy grass. Sam followed. They found Henry in almost the exact spot as before. Knees tucked up, shoulders hunched, one thin hand curled around a stem of wild grass. The boy was smaller than Sam remembered, or maybe it was the way his body folded in on itself, as if trying to disappear. The cemetery air felt thick, the kind of quiet that magnifies every sound, a bird's wings flitting in the holly, the distant creak of a wrought iron gate, the faint shiver of breath catching. Sam kept his distance, uncertain whether comfort would help or simply dissolve the fragile spell of the moment. He watched as Riley approached, paws silent on the moss, body low, posture careful. The dog sat beside the boy, not crowding him, just being near. Henry leaned against Riley's side, hiding his face in the animal's thick coat, shoulders shaking with a soundless grief. Sam felt himself holding his own breath, not wanting to break whatever was passing between the two. In that hush, he recognized something familiar, a child's instinct to seek solace where words fail. The boy's small fist tightened in Riley's fur, fingers clinging as if to a rope in high water. Riley didn't move, only turned his head to nuzzle the back of Henry's hand with the tip of his nose, then let out a long, quiet sigh that seemed to draw some of the pain out of the boy and hold it gently, as only a dog can. Sam saw the whole tableau from a few steps away. The boy, the dog, the gentle curve of a small back heaving with silent sobs, the reed fallen across Riley's paw. The wind lifted a scatter of leaves, carrying the scent of wet stone and cold earth. Sam's eyes burned, not with tears, but with the ache of recognizing another's suffering and knowing how it feels to hold it in. He made his way to a bench a little way off, far enough to grant privacy, close enough that his presence might be felt, if needed. He sat, elbows on his knees, hands clasped, watching as Henry's tears eventually slowed. The boy wiped his face with the sleeve of his jacket, then ran his fingers over the name carved into the headstone, lips moving in a whisper too faint to reach Sam's ears. Riley pressed closer, patient and present, as if guarding something sacred. The minutes slipped by, marked only by the occasional gust or the rustle of a squirrel in the hedges. Sam let the weight of his own sorrow settle beside him on the bench, no longer fighting to disguise it. He studied Henry's posture, the way the boy held himself together, the careful, practiced stillness, the refusal to look up. He recognized the gesture. It was his own, years ago, at a graveside much like this, the day they buried his father, pretending not to need, pretending not to break. Eventually, Henry's hand drifted from the stone to Riley's ruff, tracing small, nervous circles in the fur. The dog closed his eyes, breathing slow and deep, letting the child lean into him as much as he needed. Sam felt his own eyes sting, the old lesson returning. Strength is not the absence of grief, but the willingness to let it move through you. He wanted to say something, anything, words of comfort, or a promise that things get better. But in the hush of that place, language felt inadequate, even intrusive. Some wounds, he knew, were honored only by being witnessed. Riley gave a gentle lick to Henry's knuckles, then raised his head to meet Sam's gaze. There was a silent plea in that look, a request for patience, for understanding, for space enough to let this moment be what it was. Sam nodded, barely perceptible, granting permission. The world seemed to contract around them, holding the boy's pain, Sam's watching, and the dog's unspoken care in a delicate balance. After a long time, Henry let go of Riley, sat back on his heels, and used the cuff of his jacket to dry his cheeks. He did not look at Sam, did not speak, but when he rose, the movement was less brittle. He placed the reed carefully at the foot of the headstone, a child's offering to memory, then reached out to squeeze Riley's ear with a gratitude too complicated for words. The dog's tail thumped softly 1, 2, 3 times against the earth. Without a backward glance, the boy slipped away among the stones, body slender and upright, head bowed only a little less than before. Riley watched him go, then turned and padded to Sam, pressing his side against Sam's knee. Sam laid a heavy hand on the dog's head and closed his eyes, letting the sadness pass through him, realizing, perhaps for the first time in years, that the only thing more human than pretending to be strong is allowing yourself to be seen in your weakness. As the sun slanted low behind the trees, Sam and Riley remained there in the quiet, sharing the hush and the healing that comes not from answers, but from presence. The kind that says without a single word, "You are not alone in this." That autumn week, the days shortened by minutes. Night seemed to arrive before the sun was fully gone, seeping into the edges of afternoon like a slow, sure tide. The world outside Sam's window blurred and grew colder, the fields rimmed with hoarfrost by dawn, and dusk coming with the hush of flocks spiraling south. At home, Sam filled his evenings with work, tidying the porch, fixing a leaky gutter, organizing the half-forgotten piles in the garage. He told himself there was comfort in order, in the small rituals of keeping things from falling into disrepair. But even as he moved from room to room, Riley's presence trailed him. The dog would follow, settle on the worn rug, watch with his heavy-lidded gaze. Sometimes Sam would feel those eyes and, for a moment, feel less certain of his own routine, less sure of what was habit and what was need. When Saturday came, the wind was cold and clear. Sam woke early, made his coffee, poured a splash into the battered blue bowl Riley had used since he was a pup. It felt right to keep to the rhythm, to return to the cemetery as always. He wrapped his old army coat tight, let Riley leap into the truck's bed. They drove in companionable silence, the landscape muted by distance and early frost. The cemetery was nearly empty, except for the pair of groundskeepers raking leaves near the far gate, and the sound of a distant lawnmower, its engine low and patient. The air was still, filled with the scent of cold grass and the sharp, faintly medicinal tang of chrysanthemums. Sam's breath plumed before him as he walked the familiar path, feeling the crunch of frost beneath his boots. He paused at his wife's grave, straightening the small copper vase that always listed sideways after a storm. He wiped his hand across the stone, tracing the carved name with his thumb, then sat on the old wooden bench across the lane, a habit that had become less a vigil and more a quiet keeping of company. Riley lay beside him, head high, ears perked for sounds that only he could hear. Across the cemetery, Sam caught sight of Henry. The boy appeared as if conjured by the mist, ghost quiet, hands stuffed in his jacket, head down. He moved along the lines of graves with a kind of practiced invisibility, his steps careful not to disturb the world around him. He carried nothing but himself, no flowers, no reed, no offering. Sam watched him weave between the stones, pausing now and then to look back, as if seeking approval from some hidden observer. Riley noticed first. With no sound at all, he rose and trotted across the damp grass toward the boy. Henry stopped, but did not turn. When Riley reached him, he knelt without hesitation, hands gentle on the dog's neck. The two of them remained there a long while. No words, only the faint shift of breath and the touch of fur on skin. Sam, from his bench, found his heart slowing, some of its ache easing in the sight. After a time, Sam stood, hands deep in his coat pockets. He walked across the lawn and stopped a little ways off, close enough to be present, but far enough not to intrude. He could see Henry's shoulders, less tense than before, posture looser, more like a boy simply tired at the end of a long walk. The afternoon light softened, painting long blue shadows on the grass. Clouds moved across the sun, and the air felt briefly warmer, carrying with it the dry, nostalgic scent of leaves. In the distance, a church bell tolled, its sound slow, dignified. Sam sat again, this time on a different bench, facing the place where Henry and Riley kept company. He folded his hands, watched, and waited. Riley lay at Henry's side, front paws stretched out, eyes closed in a kind of animal meditation. Henry's hand rested in the thick fur behind Riley's ears, absently stroking. Sam watched them, two figures small and smaller, together in a space made for sorrow but inhabited now by something quieter, more patient. Eventually, Henry stood, brushing dirt from his knees. He didn't look at Sam. Instead, he bent to gather a few stray leaves, arranging them in a tidy pile at the foot of the headstone he'd been sitting by. It was a small act, careful, and Sam recognized in it the way people mark the world when words won't do. Riley watched, tail thumping once, then fell silent again. Henry wiped his eyes with the sleeve of his jacket, gave Riley a quick, grateful squeeze and started away, moving slow, as if testing whether someone might stop him. Sam stayed on the bench, unmoving, offering only his steady presence as the boy passed by. Riley, for his part, did not follow immediately. He sat, ears forward, gaze tracking Henry until the boy vanished into the warren of stones. Then, with a sigh, the dog returned to Sam and settled at his feet. For a long time after, Sam remained where he was. Riley's warmth pressed against his ankles. He listened to the hush that followed, the wind in the high trees, the scrape of the rake on gravel, the engine of a departing truck far down the lane. He let the quiet settle over him, not as a weight, but as a blanket, a space where he could be both less and more than he usually allowed himself. He thought of all the ways people show up for each other when they can't fix what's broken. Silent presences in waiting rooms, the weight of a hand on a shoulder, the offer of coffee poured quietly in the kitchen after bad news. He realized with a pang that sometimes love is simply sitting, bearing witness, not rushing in to fill the space with explanations or consolation. Riley turned his head, pressed his nose against the back of Sam's hand. Sam let his fingers move slowly through the coarse fur, grounding himself in the now. He closed his eyes for a moment and listened to the measured beating of his own heart, the slow, sure rhythm of being alive and being seen. When at last he rose to leave, Sam took one final look across the cemetery. The place felt different, less like an echo chamber for grief, more like a haven for those quietly learning how to go on. He walked Riley back to the truck, the dog's steps unhurried, his gaze turned back once, as if to make sure nothing essential had been left behind. On the ride home, Sam said nothing, but the hush between man and dog felt softer than it had in a long time. The world outside passed in streaks of gold and gray, and for the first time in months, Sam let himself hope, not for answers, but for the small, steady comfort of company that did not require words. By November, the leaves had finished their slow descent. Skeleton branches rattled against the early dark, and the wind learned to howl again, threading its cold fingers beneath doors and into dreams. At the cemetery, the grass had dulled to the color of old canvas, and the headstones stood out stark and lonesome in the hush. The world seemed to be holding its breath, suspended between the last traces of warmth and the full arrival of winter. Sam's life settled into a pattern as spare and predictable as the landscape. Mornings spent at the kitchen window, hands wrapped around a chipped mug, Riley curled on the faded mat nearby. After lunch, the daily walk, the same streets, the same half-smiled greetings from neighbors. On Saturdays, always the cemetery. Sam made no excuses for these visits, no explanations if anyone asked. The ritual was its own answer, a way of remembering, and perhaps a way of not letting go entirely. It was on one of those pale afternoons that Sam noticed a change, a new rhythm, small but persistent. Henry was there before them now, waiting in the lee of the low stone wall, his slight frame huddled inside a jacket too big for his shoulders. Every week, the boy sat beside the same grave, knees drawn to his chest, eyes focused on the ground. Sometimes he came with nothing at all, sometimes with a handful of wildflowers, sometimes with the same reed or a single feathered leaf. At first, Sam kept his distance. He stood at the far end of the path, hands buried in his coat, Riley at his side. He watched the boy's rituals, the way he pressed his palm flat to the cold granite, the way his lips moved in a silent conversation with the earth, the way he would sit for long stretches without fidgeting, his stillness absolute. There was something familiar in those gestures, the kind of quiet that only comes from carrying too much, too young. Riley, meanwhile, seemed to have found a new gravity. Each time they entered the gates, his attention shifted, his steps gaining purpose. He would break away from Sam, trotting straight to Henry, sitting down close, sometimes near enough for their shoulders to touch, sometimes just within arm's reach, as if offering himself up as shelter without demand. Henry would let his hand trail through Riley's fur, the motion slow and deliberate, as if memorizing the shape of comfort. Riley's eyes would half close, his body going still and heavy, a silent weight beside the child. Over the weeks, Sam noticed how Henry's presence began to color his own experience of the place. The cemetery, once a territory of private grief, now felt shared, occupied by 3 instead of 2. Sam began to anticipate the boy's arrival, a flash of blonde hair behind the hedge, the quick dart of eyes, the soft sound of footsteps in wet grass. He found himself measuring his own movements, slowing his approach so as not to intrude, learning to let the moments open and close as they wished. There were other details, too, small and significant. Henry's habit of tracing the engraved letters on the headstone, or arranging pebbles in neat rows along its base. Once Sam watched the boy take off his glove and lay his bare palm flat on the cold marble, his face turned away from the world. Riley, sensing the shift, nudged Henry's side with his nose and remained pressed close until the boy's breathing calmed. Sam, for his part, stayed at a distance. He would sit on the same bench or lean against the old elm tree, hands cupped around a thermos, gaze fixed somewhere beyond the immediate. But his attention sharpened. The way Henry's shoulders would hitch in a private sigh, the way he would look up at Riley, seeking, always seeking. Sam recognized something in those glances, something that belonged to the long afternoons after his wife's passing, when the house had felt too big and even breathing seemed like work. One Saturday, the wind was especially sharp, cutting through scarves and sleeves. Henry arrived with a small bouquet of asters, the petals bruised from the cold. He placed them gently on the grave, then sat with Riley tucked against his hip, both of them hunched against the weather. Sam watched from the bench, arms wrapped around his chest, letting the silence expand between them. He studied the boy's profile, the set of his jaw, the slight tremor in his hands. Sam found himself thinking of his wife's laughter, the way she had once run through fields with a dog, not unlike Riley, her hair blowing wild. He saw a memory then, a flicker, not quite clear, of a photograph tucked away in an old album. His wife as a younger woman, crouched beside a puppy, a child's hand resting gently atop the dog's head. The image shimmered in his mind, overlapping with the scene before him. It struck Sam then. The echo. The pattern repeating itself, years removed but deeply familiar. A child, a dog, a grave, and the silent transfer of comfort from one to another. He wondered, not for the first time, who Henry was mourning, what loss had hollowed him out so young. He wondered, too, about Riley's history, the years before the fire, the lives the dog had touched before fate had bound them together. On the walk back to the truck that afternoon, Sam felt Riley's weight at his side, steady and sure. He placed a hand on the dog's head and left it there, not moving until Riley gave a contented, heavy sigh. The gesture was small, but in it was everything Sam had learned about staying, about not turning away from pain, his own or another's. As they drove home, dusk folding in around the headlights, Sam glanced at Riley curled in the seat beside him. The dog watched the world passing, eyes half closed, body loose with trust. For the first time in many months, Sam felt the edge of hope, soft and uncertain, a sense that perhaps, in all this repetition, in these quiet gestures and unspoken rituals, there was a memory being carried forward, and maybe even a beginning, not just an end. The first snow fell in hesitant flurries, barely dusting the porch steps before dissolving into the grain of the old wood. Sam woke to a quiet world, the street muffled, the maples outside bare and stark against the clouded sky. Winter always had a way of sharpening memory. Each cold morning seemed to hold a mirror to the past, showing him not just what was gone, but what might still be waiting to be found. He spent the morning in the back room, where the light was soft and unhurried. The shelves there held the detritus of another life, a shoebox of old letters, a faded baseball cap, his wife's gardening gloves. He found himself searching through drawers without knowing exactly what he sought, guided by a restlessness that had no name. Riley followed, his nails clicking on the hardwood, occasionally nudging Sam's calf with a cool nose, offering company more than curiosity. At the bottom of an old cedar chest, beneath a stack of winter scarves, Sam uncovered a thin photo album, the plastic sleeves warped and cloudy with time. He carried it to the kitchen table, set it down carefully, and sat for a long moment before opening the cover. The first images were as expected: wedding pictures, blurry snapshots of Christmas mornings, his wife's crooked smile beneath a wide-brimmed sun hat. But a few pages in, the memories shifted. A much younger Sam, hair darker and thicker, crouching beside a pup with oversized paws and ears not yet grown into themselves. His wife knelt beside him, one arm wrapped around a small, tow-headed child, whose face was turned toward the dog with the kind of trust only children possess. Sam traced the photograph with a thumb. The dog, Riley, unmistakable even then, looked straight at the camera, expression wise and solemn. The boy's hand rested on Riley's head, fingers tangled in the soft fur between his ears. The memory floated up, half-formed and bittersweet. An afternoon in late spring, the backyard full of dandelions, his wife laughing as the boy tried to teach Riley to shake hands. The sound of that laughter seemed to echo now in the hush of the kitchen, distant but persistent, like music heard through a closed window. Sam let the album fall open to a later page, another image of his wife, standing in front of the old church, a child on her hip, Riley circling their feet. He wondered how long it had been since he'd thought about that summer. Before the moves, before the job took over, before everything that mattered grew shadowed by everything that hurt. The past, he realized, was not just something to be mourned, but something that kept returning in shapes both familiar and strange. He glanced at Riley, who was watching him now from the doorway, ears tilted forward, eyes searching Sam's face for a clue. Sam smiled, a rare, small thing, and beckoned the dog over. Riley crossed the kitchen, sitting so close their knees touched. Sam reached out and ran his hand down the dog's back, feeling the warmth beneath the thick fur, the steady rise and fall of breath. In that moment, Sam sensed an old bond rekindling, the kind that can stretch across years, across sorrow and distance, and remain unbroken. The snow continued to fall through the afternoon, the flakes now larger, swirling in uncertain spirals outside the glass. By evening, the town was hushed, the streetlights turning the drifts blue at their edges. Sam sat in the living room, the old album on his lap, the fire burning low in the grate. He tried to remember more about the child in the photos, about that summer, a neighbor's son, a distant cousin, or someone closer, someone his wife had cared for when Sam was working long hours, details lost, perhaps, to time and the natural sifting of memory. A knock at the door startled him. Riley raised his head, tail thumping once, but it was only the mail carrier, dropping a stack of envelopes on the stoop. Sam shuffled through them. Bills, a flyer for groceries, a handwritten note from an old friend. He thought again of all the small connections that make up a life, how easily they can fray or be forgotten. That night, as he lay awake, Sam's mind circled the images in the album. The tilt of Riley's head, the look in his wife's eyes, the way the child had clung to both of them as if he belonged nowhere else. The realization crept in slowly, a quiet question. Was there more to this story than he'd allowed himself to remember? Was there some link between his wife's past and the boy at the cemetery that he had overlooked in his years of careful grieving? The next morning, with the snow crisp on the ground and the air bright with the promise of sun, Sam found himself drawn to the closet where his wife had kept her keepsakes. There, tucked into a small wooden box, he discovered a faded note written in her looping, uncertain script. It was brief, almost a fragment. "Some bonds are never lost. You will understand someday. Forgive me for what I cannot say." He read the line twice, then a third time. His breath catching, he sat down on the bed, Riley settling by his feet, and let the words echo through him. The presence of the past, he thought, was not always a weight. Sometimes it was a door, waiting to be opened, a way back not just to memory, but to meaning. He resolved that afternoon to pay closer attention, to watch Henry more carefully at the cemetery, to ask questions, not out loud, but in the slow, deliberate language of action and witness, to let Riley lead him through memory, through grief, through whatever waited in the world that was not yet finished with him. And as the sun began its early descent, Sam felt a little less alone in his searching. The past was not behind him, he understood now. It was all around, stitched into the present, waiting to be named, to be seen, and, if he was brave enough, to be claimed. The wind rattled the house all evening, sweeping small branches across the roof, drawing long sighs through the gaps in the old window panes. It was a night that seemed made for remembering, when the world pressed close, and even the rooms Sam had grown used to filled up with shadows from another time. He read until late, not so much to learn as to keep his mind from drifting. The photo album lay open on the kitchen table, a river of old sunlight pouring from one page to the next. Riley shifted restlessly between rooms, sometimes lying at Sam's feet, sometimes stationed by the front door, as if waiting for someone to arrive who never would. The house was warm enough, but there was a coldness inside Sam that the fire could not reach. Sleep did not come easy. When it did, it was troubled, scenes bleeding into each other, the echo of a child's voice, the silent presence of his wife walking ahead through fields lit by that unearthly blue just before dawn. Sam woke again and again, each time with the sense that he was missing something just out of reach. Each time he opened his eyes, Riley was there, quietly vigilant, sometimes sitting by the door, sometimes at the window, staring into the dark as if he could see further than a man ever could. Toward morning, when the sky outside was only a pale suggestion beyond the frost-streaked glass, Sam heard the faintest whimper, so soft he might have dreamed it. He sat up, blankets falling to the floor, and listened. Riley stood by the back door, tail stiff, ears pitched forward, his whole posture alert but not alarmed. Without thinking, Sam pulled on his boots, shrugged into his old coat, and opened the door to the world outside. The night air was sharp, so cold it pinched the skin, and the yard gleamed with a thin crust of snow. Riley stepped out first, nose to the wind, and glanced back only once to be sure Sam was following. The walk to the cemetery was short in distance but long in feeling. A hush pressed down on the world, each footstep muffled. The sounds of traffic in town blotted out by the thick weight of sleeping winter. There was light on the horizon. Not yet morning, but the first hint of it. Blue and tentative. The cemetery gates were still as always, the path inside marked by Sam's own prints, overlaid now by smaller ones. Barely visible, but there. Sam paused to study them, his breath floating in front of his face. Riley moved ahead, tail low, steps deliberate, the dog's presence anchoring him to the moment. They found Henry standing beside the old elm, hands tucked into his jacket, a reed in his grip bent nearly in half. The boy looked smaller than ever in the uncertain light, his silhouette shivering slightly, whether from cold or feeling, Sam couldn't say. For a long while neither moved. The boy gazed out over the stones, posture wary but unafraid. Riley moved in close and sat beside him, a solid, living warmth in the icy gloom. Sam wanted to say something, to call out, but stopped himself. He stood there in the dimness, letting the world arrange itself around the boy and the dog, letting the quiet deepen until it felt holy. Henry glanced sideways, meeting Sam's eyes only briefly. There was a hauntedness there, but also something defiant, a determination not to ask for help, not to expose what hurt. It was Henry who broke the spell, voice so quiet it barely rose above the wind. "I just want her to know I haven't forgotten." He didn't look at Sam as he spoke. The words were for the ground, for the stone, for the air, and maybe, Sam thought, for himself. Riley pressed closer, nuzzling the boy's shoulder, and Henry's grip tightened on the reed until it snapped in his hand. For a moment, it seemed as if the boy might cry, but instead he drew in a long breath, wiped his face with the back of his hand, and stood straighter. The gesture was not bravado nor surrender. It was something in between, the strength that comes from being seen, even in your smallest moment. Sam watched all this in silence, feeling his own chest ache with the recognition of it. He wanted to offer comfort, to reach out, but something deeper held him back, a respect for the boy's dignity, for the silence that had formed between them over the months. Sometimes love was not in the reaching, but in the waiting, the bearing witness. Henry stepped away from the tree, leaving the broken reed at the base of the headstone. He looked at Sam, eyes hollow but shining. Then, without another word, he disappeared into the maze of stones, his form soon swallowed by the first gold of morning. Riley lingered, unmoving, gaze fixed on the spot where the boy had stood. Sam crouched down, laying a hand on the dog's neck, feeling the warmth there, the heartbeat steady and slow. He stayed that way a long while, the hush of dawn settling around them both. Above, the sky opened gradually, streaked with color, promising the brief mercy of winter sun. When Sam finally stood and turned homeward, Riley followed, walking so close their legs brushed. No words had been exchanged, but something had passed between them. A permission, an understanding, a small measure of hope. The world was not healed, not yet, but there was a message in the night, that remembering is an act of love, and that no sorrow, if shared, ever truly stays alone. As they returned home, the house seemed warmer, the day gentler, the burden just a little lighter. Riley curled on the mat by the fire, eyes closing at last. Sam poured a fresh cup of coffee and sat by the window, letting the silence fill up with meaning. The sun climbed, slow and bright, over the edge of town, and Sam knew that night, brief as it was, had left something behind. a message in the darkness. A small, flickering promise that even the deepest losses can find company and comfort, if only for a little while. By the first days of December, winter had declared itself fully. Snow covered the lawns and rooftops, settling in soft blue shadows against porch rails and windowsills. The world was hushed and dim, muffled by weather and by the kind of silence that lingers after a long-held question has almost, but not quite, been answered. Inside Sam's house, the air felt different. Every drawer, every shelf seemed charged with some quiet expectancy, as if memory itself had grown restless. On a morning cold enough that the windows glazed over with frost, Sam found himself standing before the old armoire in the bedroom. He wasn't sure what had brought him there, some thread of restlessness perhaps, or the unshakable sense of something left undone. He opened the drawers slowly, running his hand over the folded sweaters, the scent of cedar rising into the chill. Near the back, beneath a stack of flannel shirts, his fingers brushed against a folded envelope, brittle at the corners and yellowed with age. The handwriting on the front stopped him. It was hers, his wife's. Familiar, flowing, a line of comfort written in another time. He hesitated only a moment, then drew out the letter and sat on the bed, Riley hopping up beside him with an ease that belied his age. He opened the envelope and unfolded the single sheet inside, careful not to tear the thinning paper. Her voice seemed to fill the room, not in sound, but in the slow, graceful arc of her script. He read it once through in silence, his eyes moving steadily, his hands trembling by the end. She had written of a child, a boy, not of her body, but of her heart. A child she'd cared for in a time when Sam was away, working shifts that stretched until dawn. She told how the boy had clung to her, calling her mom, how Riley, only a pup, would curl at the child's feet. She wrote of the bitter day when the boy's birth family had returned, reclaiming him with promises that they would visit, that the bonds of those months would not be forgotten. But years passed, and the world moved on. I have loved him as my own, she'd written, even as I let him go. If you ever find him again, Sam, let him know he was never unloved. Let him know he was never left behind. Sam's chest tightened, a quiet ache rising up through the years. He remembered suddenly the laughter in the backyard, the feel of small hands clutching his sleeve, the silent, hollow Sunday when the boy's things were gone. He had buried those memories beneath layers of responsibility, beneath the habit of strength. Riley pressed his muzzle against Sam's thigh, eyes searching Sam's face for a cue. Sam rested his palm atop the dog's head and closed his eyes, the warmth of living fur grounding him. He let the feeling wash over him, regret, gratitude, and a kind of peace that he'd never expected to find in this life. He wept then, quietly, without shame, his shoulders shaking as the tears came, not just for the child, but for his wife, for the long ache of holding everything inside. Riley leaned closer, lending his body as shelter, letting Sam grieve in the shelter of their shared silence. When the tears slowed, Sam stroked the dog's ears with slow, steady hands, feeling the steadiness return. Later, with the letter tucked carefully into his coat, Sam and Riley walked to the cemetery, the snow crunching underfoot. The town was still, Sunday bells echoing from the church, windows glowing against the dusk. The air was so cold it seemed to crystallize each breath. At the cemetery, the world was painted in shades of blue and white, every headstone capped with snow, the sky heavy with cloud. Henry was already there, sitting cross-legged beside the same grave, a scarf wrapped high around his chin. He didn't look up when Sam approached, but Riley went straight to him, pressing his body close until Henry's hand slid absently through his fur. Sam sat on the stone bench, pulling the letter from his pocket. For a long while he held it in his lap, unsure whether to speak or stay silent. In the end, he simply placed the envelope on the cold stone near Henry, let his hand rest there for a breath, and waited. Henry glanced down, eyes searching the handwriting. He did not pick it up, but his gaze lingered on the shape of his own name in the address, written in a hand he somehow recognized, though he could not recall when. Tears welled up in his eyes, but he blinked them away. Instead, he leaned into Riley, his thin shoulders pressed into the dog's steady warmth. Sam said nothing, offered nothing but presence and patience. He watched as Henry read, watched the small tremor in his lips, the way his face turned away from the world, the way he held the letter as if it were breakable, sacred. The sky above began to darken, flakes drifting slowly down, settling in Henry's hair, on Riley's back, on Sam's open hand. There was no need for explanations, no need for words. The truth, once uncovered, did not shout or demand. It settled softly, like the snow, over each of them, offering forgiveness for what had been lost, and hope for what might yet be found. For the first time in many winters, Sam felt himself breathing more easily. His grief softened not by answers, but by connection, by the knowledge that love, even interrupted by fate, could linger long after its first beginnings. They sat together in the hush, man, boy, and dog, the cemetery growing still around them. Somewhere in the far distance, the bells rang the hour, and Sam understood, without being told, that healing sometimes arrives as quietly as winter, and that sometimes the most important truths are the ones we are brave enough to feel, not speak. The cold of winter did not loosen easily. The snow lingered in shaded corners of the cemetery, packed tight and gray against the stones. Yet in time, the world began to thaw. Water ran beneath the crust, carrying away the memory of frost. The air itself tasted different, less brittle, more forgiving. The days, little by little, stretched their light. Sam marked the passing of winter not by the calendar, but by the shift in sound and sky. The sharp cry of migrating geese, the far-off patter of meltwater falling from the eaves, the first faint scent of earth returning to itself after so long under ice. He felt a change inside him too, something opening up, making room. It was on a late afternoon, the first truly soft one of the season, that he gathered a handful of wildflowers, violets, crocus, the bright yellow forsythia that grew stubbornly against the old fence behind his house. The bouquet was small, imperfect, stems uneven and blossoms already beginning to droop. Sam wrapped them in a scrap of brown paper and slipped his wife's letter into the pocket of his coat. Riley circled him in the kitchen, tail low and wagging, sensing the significance of this day, though Sam offered no words to explain. They walked slowly through the town, the sidewalks cleared but damp, every yard a patchwork of old snow and new mud. The houses along the way were waking up, windows cracked, curtains fluttering. Sam nodded to the neighbor sweeping her steps, to the boy bouncing a basketball in his driveway, all the small tokens of community that had once felt distant and now felt gently familiar. At the cemetery, the world was in between. Some stones were still capped with snow, others ringed with new green, shoots pushing up where no one had expected life. Sam and Riley moved toward the usual spot, their footsteps leaving a trail of dark prints across the half-frozen grass. Henry was there, sitting quietly at the foot of his mother's grave. He did not rise or call out, But Sam felt something in the boy's posture, a softening, a kind of readiness. In his lap, Henry held the letter Sam had left him, folding and unfolding the paper with careful hands. When Riley approached, the boy's whole face changed. A smile, hesitant but unmistakable, flickered and settled in his eyes. Sam paused a few steps away, letting the moment stretch and settle. He placed the flowers beside the headstone, arranging them with the awkward tenderness of a man unused to such gestures, but learning to let them matter. He sat on the damp bench, coat collar pulled up, hands folded loosely in his lap. The sun had already begun to dip, the light settling into the trees with the golden patience of late afternoon. Riley pressed close to Henry, lying down with a deep, contented sigh. The boy leaned into the dog's warmth, his hand drifting unconsciously through the fur. Sam watched them, letting the hush fill up the space between them all, the way the best silences do, not with emptiness, but with a presence too large for language. For a long time they stayed that way. No one hurried. No one explained. The world moved gently around them. A crow called from the fence line. A breeze rattled the last dry leaves from the holly. Somewhere in the distance a bell sounded the hour. Henry's breathing grew steadier, his shoulders looser. Sam caught the boy looking at him, not with expectation, but with the cautious, testing hope of someone who has learned not to ask for too much. Sam met that look, and after a moment, he reached out, resting his hand on Henry's small, bony shoulder. The gesture was clumsy, uncertain, but full of meaning. "I see you. I'm here. You don't have to carry this alone." Henry did not flinch or pull away. He closed his eyes, a tear tracking down his cheek, and leaned ever so slightly into Sam's touch. Riley looked up at them both, his tail thumping once and then settled again, content. The three of them sat together as the sun slipped further behind the clouds, the shadows growing long and blue. Sam felt the old ache in his chest shift, lighten. Not gone. These things are never gone, but changed, made softer by the sharing. He thought of the letter, the words his wife had written, the child she had loved and lost, the dog who had always known the way back. He thought of the long winter, the many weeks of silence, and the way all things, grief, hope, love, circle back when given enough time and patience. When the cold crept up again, Henry opened his eyes. He looked at Sam, then at Riley, and finally at the grave, his expression both sad and at peace. There was no need for a goodbye, no need for ceremony. When he rose, he did so quietly, brushing the damp from his jeans. Sam followed, slow and careful, his hand resting gently at the boy's back. Riley circled them both, the keeper of this new, fragile family. As they walked from the cemetery, Sam glanced over his shoulder, watching the evening gather in the hollows of the land. He felt gratitude, not just for reunion, but for the kind of healing that grows in the gentle attention of presence, in the steady return of those who stay. They stepped out into the last light of day, three together, each changed, each seen, to fanfare, no proclamation, just the quiet certainty of having found, in each other, the answer to a long, unspoken question. Will anyone wait for me? Will anyone stay? And in that answer, found home. Spring did not rush its return. It crept in quietly, green mist at the edge of fields, rain seeping into the black earth, robins tracing half-finished songs from branch to branch. Sam woke one morning to the sound of rain on the roof, steady, insistent, a kind of music for beginnings. The world outside his window was soft and wet, and full of the promise that things could change slowly, almost without notice. The house itself felt changed too, though nothing dramatic had shifted. Riley no longer waited anxiously by the door. He wandered from room to room with quiet contentment, settling himself at Sam's feet when the mornings were slow or at the threshold when Henry's light footsteps came up the path. Sometimes, the boy brought a sprig of wild grass, a feather, a stone with a strange blue shimmer. Small tokens, left in the bowl on the porch or arranged in a row on the sill. On the first bright day after the rain, Sam found himself drawn again to the cemetery, not out of habit, but out of something new and tender, a wish to honor what had passed and what had endured. He moved through the kitchen, gathering small things for the visit, a fresh-cut handful of daffodils, the letter his wife had written, a pack of seed for the birds that lingered at the edge of town. Henry arrived just as Sam zipped his coat, his hair rumpled, cheeks flushed from running. He grinned, a little breathless, holding up a bouquet of tiny white violets he'd found along the ditch. Riley whined softly, tail sweeping the floor, eager to be on their way. They walked together, man, boy, and dog, moving through the bright morning, the sky reflected in shallow puddles. The air was cool but generous, carrying the scent of new grass, the sharpness of thawing mud. Sam felt each step as an act of gratitude, for survival, for second chances, for the small persistence of beauty in a world that sometimes seemed to forget how to offer it. At the cemetery gate, Henry slipped his hand into Sam's, a gesture as natural now as breathing. Riley led the way, nose down, tail up, guiding them through rows where the snow had finally melted, leaving behind only the faint memory of old sorrow. The grave was there as always, but softer, less a wound and more a place of return. Sam laid the daffodils in the vase. Henry added his violets, and together they stood in silence, letting memory pass between them like light through leaves. No words were spoken. Instead, Sam reached into his coat and set his wife's letter against the stone, tucking it gently behind the flowers. It seemed right somehow to leave it here, not as a goodbye, but as a blessing. Henry crouched, running his fingers over the carved name, his expression open, no longer haunted by the ache of being unseen. Riley lay down, head on his paws, eyes drifting closed in the warmth of sun and presence. After a time, they moved away from the grave, following the gentle slope toward the edge of the cemetery, where the grass grew wild and the breeze carried the sound of church bells. Sam paused to watch Henry walk ahead, a sprig of grass waving in his hand, Riley close behind, their shadows tangled together on the soft earth. In that small scene, Sam saw the fullness of what had changed. Not a world without loss, but a world where loss had made space for something else. Tenderness, kinship, hope. As they reached the gate, Henry glanced back. There was a question in his eyes, a lingering trace of fear. Will this stay? Will this last? Sam met his gaze and smiled. A rare smile that softened the lines at his mouth, the worry at his brow. He placed a hand gently on Henry's shoulder and squeezed. The answer did not need words. It was there in the steadiness of the grip, in the simple fact of being present, of having chosen to return again and again. They turned down the lane toward home. The day brightened, clouds scattering, the world flickering between shadow and sun. Sam felt the weight of his years differently now. Not as a burden to carry alone, but as a record of what he'd survived, what he'd learned about kindness, about trust, about the slow uncoiling of grief. That afternoon they sat together on the back steps, watching Riley chase robins from the garden, Henry's laughter ringing out clear and unexpected. Sam listened, letting the sound fill the hollows inside him. He breathed in the smell of earth, the softness of the breeze, the simple fact of the boy leaning against his side, both of them held by the gentle warmth of a dog whose faith had never faltered. In the quiet that followed, Sam realized the circle was not closed but ever widening, a loop of presence and absence, sorrow and relief, memory and promise. He looked down at Henry, who looked back with trust so whole it almost hurt to meet it. The sun dropped low, the shadows lengthened. They lingered outside until the sky deepened to blue and the first star appeared. Sam rose, gathering Henry and Riley close. Together they walked inside, carrying the dusk with them, a promise that whatever else life would bring, they would face it as they had learned. Quietly, together, step by step, with patience, with forgiveness, with a love that asked for nothing but the courage to stay. Some stories don't end. They settle into the quiet places of our lives and remind us, with every ordinary morning, that healing is rarely loud. Sometimes it's a hand on your shoulder, a dog's steady gaze, or a small boy brave enough to hope again. We learn that no one carries sorrow alone for long if someone is willing to sit beside them in silence without asking for explanations. That's how love endures, not in grand declarations, but in the slow return, the patient choosing to stay, and the gentle way grief makes room for joy. If this story found you in a quiet place, or reminded you of someone you once waited for, share your thoughts below. What small act of kindness helped you keep going, or what silent companion carried you through? Your words, like these quiet moments, might be exactly what someone else needs to hear tonight. Thank you for listening. Here's to old wounds healing, new bonds forming, and to never walking home alone.